Well, we're now going to leave the Hadrianic period and go into the Antonine period. Rather like the Emperor Trajan, the Emperor Hadrian had no children of his own, and you can suspect a good reason for that, given his relationship with Antonine, even though he desperately loved his wife. In 135, 136, he began to get rather depressed and suicidal, in fact, and also suffered from various illnesses. And so he decided to adopt this man, Lucius Ceionius Commodus, as his son and his successor. We don't really know very much about him. He may have been a distant relative of Hadrian's. He was obviously a senior senator at the time because everybody welcomed him as Hadrian's choice of successor. And of course, he's got the typically curly hair and curly beard of the Hadrianic period, as we see there. Of course, we don't know how much this particular portrait of him was deliberately meant to look like Hadrian. Notice also this very distinguishing feature, Hadrianic and post-Hadrianic sculpture, the eyes are carved in as well. Hadrian gives a big party to celebrate this, and Commodus dies the next year in 137, causing Hadrian to say what a waste of money that was. And so a rather disappointed and depressed Hadrian adopts this person as his son and successor. This is the 50-year-old Titus Aurelius Fulvius Antoninus. He's adopted in 137. Because, again, we don't know very much about him. He certainly didn't have a military career, apart from the standard year or so's military service when he was 18 or 19. He was a very good civil administrator. We do know that. He governed several provinces. So he had a very distinguished career in public administration and provincial government. He had two sons. They had both died before he was adopted by Hadrian. And at the same time that Hadrian adopts him, bearing in mind this man is 50-year-old, nobody really expects him to live for another 10 or 12 years. If a Roman reached the age of 63, a Roman male, every year after that was considered an extra bonus year. So Hadrian wants to make certain of the succession, that there will be somebody to take over from Antoninus. And he insists that Antoninus adopts these two young boys. Marcus Aurelius is Hadrian's nephew by his wife Sabina, and Lucius Ceionius Commodus, same name as the first person we saw, is the son of Hadrian's first choice of successor. He was about 15 or 16 at the time. He was roughly about 10 or so. Well, we know very little, as I said, about Antoninus before he was chosen as Hadrian's successor, but evidently the Senate approved of him. He was probably seen as a stopgap senator for 10 years, waiting for this guy to take over. But of course, if this one dies, there's the second one. We say in English, always have an heir and a spare. The heir is the person who's going to take over from you, like Prince William of Wales, and the spare is Prince Harry, his younger brother, just in case something happens to the first one, right? So you always have an heir and a spare. And this is heir, by the way, spelt like this. So you certainly have a case of an heir and a spare here with Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Ceionius Commodus. Well, when Hadrian finally does die in 138, Antoninus Pius is declared princeps without any problem at all. So he's obviously perfectly acceptable to everybody. Because the emperors who come after him to the time of Commodus, who I gather is somebody's favourite emperor, not looking at a certain person whose favouritism with Commodus was indicated in the Bill Kent News, going down to the time of Commodus, the death of Commodus in 192, and we talk about the Antonine period. They're all members of the Antonine family in one way or the other. I'm going to do my usual thing just to remind you that statues were originally painted, and this is what the evidence seems to indicate that that particular sculpture was painted like. Well, ever since the 3rd century, since the middle of the 3rd century, the early Antonine period, at least up to the time of Commodus, who becomes emperor in 180, was recognized as the peak period of the Roman Golden Age. The Golden Age of Rome, well, we talk about the Augustan Golden Age, the Flavian Golden Age, but you get this long period from Nerva, going down to the death of Antoninus Pius, when the Roman Empire is essentially at peace. It's at its largest, it's at its most prosperous. If you go around any of the really well-preserved Roman cities anywhere in the Roman Empire, Timgad in Algeria, Ephesus in Turkey, there's nowhere to go and look at in Britain, so don't bother going there. But the majority of the preserved buildings will be Hadrianic, Antonine in date. It really was very much a golden age in that particular respect. And this idea of it being a golden age is seen to a certain extent in the visual arts, which is what we'll be looking at really in today's class. Well, as you might expect, at the beginning of the reign of Antoninus Pius, you have this subtle practice of propaganda. People know that he's not related by blood to Hadrian, but the sculptures, the official portraits of the period, do their best to hint at some family resemblance. So the early statues, the early portraits we have of Antoninus Pius do make him look rather like Hadrian. There are some pretty clear differences. And again, notice the eyes indicated. This is the sort of question I might ask you as a trick one in the final exam. You see, what date is this statue? You've got the same general curly hair. Antoninus is shown with curly hair on his coinage. He's shown with a rather long face. Well, here he's not quite such a long face. You've got this same sort of beard shape. There are subtle differences between them, of course. I mean, Hadrian's got the rounder, fatter face and the kiss curls that stop more or less at the ear level. Antoninus Pius has been a bit of a rebel. He's got his hair going down over his ears. Antoninus Pius had also got these corkscrew curls at the front of his head. It sort of reminds you to a certain extent of Augustus. Remember the Augustan, the Julio-Tiberian hairstyle? It's not quite the same, but it's got that sort of little hint of Augustus about him. One of the first things that Antoninus does after becoming emperor is to somehow promote the reputation of Hadrian. Antoninus Pius. He's given the extra name of Pius. We're not exactly certain why. Very early on in his name, Pius means respectful. Now, it could be, it seems to be, one of the later Roman sources indicates that Hadrian was so hated by the senior senators at Rome that they didn't want to deify him. They didn't want to make him godlike after his death. So that what Antoninus did was to argue in the Senate that Hadrian may have had his bad points, but hey, you know, just like Stalin, he had his good points as well. And therefore he should be deified. And in fact, he was deified. The other possible explanation for why he's called Pius is that he saved certain senators from being executed in the last 2 years of Hadrian's life. We don't know the reason, but it's something to do with Hadrian, that's pretty clear. Well, having got Hadrian deified, he does what all Roman emperors do to show respect to their predecessor, to show respect to their family, in inverted commas, by building a temple to Hadrian, which was formally dedicated, we know, in the year 145. Well, there's a bit of a problem. Antoninus Pius has got a bit of a problem here in that these wonderful Dutch maps, I've not been able to find the original source of them, but they're very good. Of course, you know, the prime place to build something like this is down in the Roman Forum. This is the old centre of Rome. But there's basically no big spaces left. And ever since really early in the reign of Augustus, before that with Pompey's Theatre over there, the Septuajulia. People have been moving things, imperial buildings, monumental buildings, out into the Campus Martius. And this is where the Temple of Hadrian was built. It's a pretty massive structure. And we're very lucky in many ways that it was built somewhere to the north of the Pantheon, and there is a surviving temple there, now used as the stock exchange for Rome, which we can identify as almost certainly being what we call the Hadrianium. Well, the Hadrianium, there's no inscription on this indicating who it belongs to. But the architecture and the carvings that I'll show you in a moment are very Hadrianic and Antonine in style. It's in the right sort of place to be the Hadrianium, so it's pretty certain that this is what it was. This was a temple. Basically, one side of it is still preserved and part of the interior, converted into a Baroque palace, as you see here in this wonderful engraving by Panini in the 18th century. Now, the great thing about these guys doing all drawings and watercolours in the 18th, 17th century is that they could ignore perspective to a certain extent and fit things in on a piece of paper. Now, you try and take a photograph of it, and it really is not very easy. You know, you can't get it down in the same sort of way. But this becomes the stock exchange of Rome in the 19th century. It's still used as the stock exchange in Rome as well. This temple, we cannot be certain, 100% certain, it is the temple that deified Hadrian. We can be 99% certain, but more than that we can't go. Of the temple itself, what do we have surviving? Well, basically we've got 11 columns along the front. We've got part of the cellar wall, the temple wall there, a couple side views of it. You can see how in the medieval period they've dug into the columns to get the iron clamps out and the leg clamps as well. And you can see the Corinthian capitals are not terribly well preserved at all. The columns, incidentally, are of Proconnessian marble. Proconnesus is the island, you would know, in the middle of the Sea of Marmara, which gives its name to us as marble. So it's a white marble available from that island. It's a second-rate, cheap marble, cheaper than lunar marble. We assume so, otherwise why take it all the way from the middle of the Sea of Marmara to Rome? And it's used for quite a lot of buildings in Rome, so, you know, quite a good marble, but not the best quality at all. We've got these columns that survive on the outside. Inside, you still have the traces of the vault underneath the temple, and you have even got the remains of the original barrel vaulted ceiling. And I've never been able to find a photograph of this in any particular way, in any illustration. It's built Roman style, to a certain extent, on a podium. Excavations and analysis have given us quite a lot of detail about the plan, so we know it's on a Roman style podium. We know it's got steps at the front. We also know, however, that apart from being surrounded by this colonnade, which may have had an apse there, there's a bit of argument about this, but it's actually built in Greek style. It's what we call a peripteral temple. The columns go all the way around it. And as you can see here, we've got 8 columns across the front, so it's octo style, and we've got 13 columns along the side. This ties up with it being Hadrianic to a certain extent. Remember, of Hadrian's 2 largest buildings in Rome, apart from the mausoleum, the Pantheon, perfectly Roman. Concrete, brick and concrete, round, massive dome on the top. You don't find this in Greek architecture. Temple of Venus and Roma, Greek-style temple, sitting on steps, not on a podium, peripteral columns all the way around, but the 2 cellar back to front. Well, here we have a Greek-type temple. Yes, we get this sort of plan at an earlier date, the Temple of Castor, by Tiberius is the same sort of thing. But this helps support this idea that this particular temple was dedicated to Hadrian. It's got that Greekness about it. Further evidence that this was the Hadrianum comes from a series of reliefs that were found inside the temple, in between these engaged columns or pilasters. A series of reliefs which unfortunately were removed without a proper record of exactly where they come from, so we don't have the full sequence. And they're now on display in the Capitoline Museum, which has got all these odd bits and pieces. Some of you might recognize this. Yes, the upward pointing finger of Constantine, which I'll be talking about later. This is actually my favourite, an inscription commemorating the conquest of Britain by Claudius, about how he defeated 12 kings and so forth. But what we have on display inside the museum there, the Capitoline Museum, a series of reliefs like this, some of them with figures that represent provinces or territories, female personifications. Remember the Sebasteion in Aphrodisias, this use of the female figure to represent a territory. It could be a civilized territory, it could be a barbarian territory, but a female figure always used to represent a territory of one kind or another. You've also got a series of reliefs which represent weapons from various wars. Let's look at this bit a bit more detail. They're rather stylized weapons and shields. We can't really see if they're meant to represent Roman weapons or barbarian weapons, but the Romans never used an axe, so that would tend to indicate that this is some kind of barbarian symbol there. The female personifications are unfortunately, in a lot of cases, without any obvious attribute. We don't have something with them that indicates who they are. So we can't always identify which province or which region is being referred to. I stress region because one of these figures we can identify was a territory that was not within the Roman Empire. But you've got these standing female figures, and of course these are all done in that classical Greek style that Hadrian likes. Think of the Portogallo reliefs, the apotheosis of Sabina, that sort of plain background. So it sort of fits in with like that. They're pretty well done in many ways. Now there's been a lot of restoration on these because I think they were recovered in the 16th or 17th century. By attributes, I mean things like, well, that flag, it may have had something painted on it to indicate which particular territory it is. This armour should signify something. It looks kind of Greek. It might be Macedonia, for example. It might be a Macedonian armour. This is pretty certainly Scythia. Barbarians are always shown in trousers with loose-fitting belted tunics like this, and she's holding a sword of a type which we know were used by the Scythians, the people who live in what is now the modern Ukraine. This is either Parthia or Armenia. It's a bit difficult to decide who it is, but again it's a barbarian, an eastern barbarian, a different type of tunic, holding this, which is a quiver. A quiver, the container for arrows. So we're looking at somebody who's associated with archery. Well, the Parthians are very famous for their archery. But this headdress looks more like Armenia. Armenia, that sort of hotly disputed territory, which had always been fought over and argued over between Parthia and the Roman Empire. Whoever controlled Armenia can easily attack the other side. This is almost certainly Achaia, Greece. She's had her breasts cut down rather a lot, unfortunately, but you can tell she's got this typical Greek hairstyle. So we can identify some of these provinces, we can identify some of these regions. Well, this would fit in with this being Hadrianum. The style of the figures, that classicizing Greek style that Hadrian tried to go back to, first used by Augustus, that's pretty typically Hadrianic. But what is Hadrian most famous for, apart from his affair with Antinous? He spent half of his time as emperor, slightly more than half of his time as emperor, travelling around the provinces of the Roman Empire, checking on their security, checking on their frontiers, checking on their defences, checking on the economic situation and things like that. So we can see that these would fit in with this particular structure, now the stock exchange at Rome, as having originally been the Hadrianium. Well, at about the same time that Antoninus started work on the Hadrianium, right at the very beginning of his reign, he also arranged for his wife, Faustina the Elder, or Faustina the Major, a greatly respected person in her own right, to be given the title of Augusta. Not every emperor's wife received the title of Augusta, so it's very much a symbol of the great respect felt towards her. Well, the portraits of her show her with this incredibly distinctive hairstyle at the top there, and she's shown very well on coins with this. She's got this hair that's been pulled up from the back, plaited round, coiled up on top of the head like that, completely unlike the Flavian hairstyles or anything in the Trajanic period. You know, it's almost like she's got a bird's nest on the top. You know, you can just imagine a sort of Easter chicken sticking out of there with some eggs behind it. So the hair is pulled up in a series of braids. You've got some idea of how they're being pulled right back from the front in that particular way there. Well, when we look at her face on portraits like this, she looks a little bit stern in many ways. She's still got rather full, sensuous lips, though. I think one can agree with that. These rather dreamy eyes, but we've got heavily drilled pupils here. Her coin portraits are a little less flattering. She's got rather large chin and a rather large throat in many ways. But what it was, Antoninus loved her. He really loved her. He's reported to have written somewhere that I would rather live in Gaeta, an island in the Mediterranean where Romans were sent if to be punished. I would rather live there with Faustina than to be emperor without her. But unfortunately, 2 years after he became emperor, she died. We get an indication of just how much he loved her because she was deified, made godlike, but also one of the most common types of coin that we can find from this period, silver denarius, about just over a centimetre diameter, all dedicated to Diva Faustina, the goddess Faustina. What better way to commemorate your love for somebody than to say, right, I want all the coins made with her face on it and dedicated to her. People are going to know how important she was to me. But an even greater expression in many ways, and you can see, you know, her hairstyle more clearly here. You know, these sort of little braids coming up from the back like that. I mean, it's really quite a complicated one. I dare one of you to try this. Go on, you can try it. You've got the right type of curly hair.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I got confused. Was she Hadrian's wife? Or?
No, Sabina is Hadrian's wife.
Oh, so
Faustina is Antoninus' wife.
Okay.
Sabina died a lot earlier than that. Go on, do your hair like that for the next class. Please, please. But an even greater expression in many ways of just how much he loved her was that he got permission, while he is emperor, to build a temple to her in the Roman Forum. Now, the Roman Forum by this time was pretty full of buildings, most of them somehow connected to Augustus and Julius Caesar. There weren't very many spaces left. Hadrian had rebuilt the temple, the House of the Vestal Virgins here. Antoninus Pius rebuilt the Temple of Vesta there. The Regia, the origins go right back to regnal Rome. We're not exactly certain what there might have been here. This seems to have been an empty space in between the Temple of Peace of Vespasian and the Forum of Augustus and Forum of Julius Caesar and Trajan's Forum. But there were very, very few spaces available to build a temple in the Roman Forum, but Antoninus Pius does it, and that's where it is. And this is what it looks like when we look across. Here's the Basilica Julia, Temple of Castor, Temple of Vesta, Arch of Titus, Flavian Amphitheatre, Temple of Venus and Roma over there. We'll be looking at this in a future class. And that column is a 4th century column, so we can ignore that particular one there. We're very fortunate in that this temple was converted into a church at an early date, probably in the 5th century, but possibly in the 6th or 7th century. It remained a church until relatively recently, I think until Mussolini's time. And apart from losing the back and losing its pediment when the front was reconstructed in the Renaissance period, it is in pretty good original condition. It's a real Etrusco-Italian temple, in the sense that it stands on a high podium, a series of steps originally of marble at the front. The stone used for this is grey peperino there. We can see here it's hexastyle with a deep pronaos. We've got coins that tell us what the temple looked like when it was dedicated, as we have here this one again of the Diva Faustina series, and you can just see the statues on the either side of the entrance there. Well, the sides, this sort of grey-brownish stone is the most common building stone in Rome, in the Roman period. It's a volcanic stuff. It's known as volcanic tuff, not stuff. Peperino, because it's got a kind of pepperish colour to it. Originally, this would have been covered, of course, with white marble. All these holes you can see are where people in the medieval period have dug inside to get the iron and the lead out. You can still see there's a reasonable amount of it still left, including the steps at the front there. You can also see the base of the altar. These steps were reconstructed, I think, by Mussolini, and as this coin shows us, originally there were statues on either side, a cult figure of Faustina that must have been visible from the pronaos there, pediment decoration and acroteria as well. So, and also that lovely little fence along the bottom so that people can't get in there unless they're officially allowed inside there. The columns at the front are rather remarkable in a way. It doesn't show so clearly here. Nice hexastyle columns, they're 40 metres high, including the Corinthian capitals, which are now rather badly preserved. But they're made of this type of marble. It's known as cipollino. Cipollino means onion. And the reason why it's called an onion is it's basically a green, but you've got these dark green and white layers. It looks as if you've cut a slice through the side of an onion. So this Castilian marble, which comes from Greece, known as cipollino. The frieze on the entablature survives in pretty good condition. It's a very unusual frieze, and nobody's really quite come up with an explanation as to why Antoninus Pius chose this one. Incidentally, you can just see where the back end of the temple was chopped off by one of the popes who wanted to use something from there. I can't quite remember what it was now. But the frieze consists of griffins. You've got acanthus scrolls there, and you've got candelabra, candle supports as well. Nobody's really come up with a sensible explanation as to this rather odd system of decoration. There's nothing quite like it. It's Eastern in character, but why would Antoninus Pius choose an Eastern decoration for this? Nobody really knows. The front of the temple carries the dedication to the Diva Faustina Augusta, dedicated by the Senate, from the Senate, by consultation with the Senate there. After Antoninus Pius died, the temple was rededicated to him as well. So you have that Divo Antonino on the top, et Diva Faustina, carrying on from there. In 145, Antoninus' daughter, Faustina the Younger, was married off to Marcus Aurelius. This is all part of the idea of trying to keep the family going, keep the family going, keep the family going. Now remember, when Antoninus was chosen to succeed Hadrian, he was already 50 or so, 51. Nobody really expected him to live for a great length of time. This is why you have Marcus Aurelius and Lucius as an heir and a spare. And obviously, Antoninus Pius wants to make certain that Marcus Aurelius has lots of children as well. Well, 2 years later, they produced their first child, and the very next day, Antoninus publicly confirms Marcus Aurelius as his chosen successor by making him commander of all the Roman armies. Well, Marcus Aurelius and Faustina were to go on to have at least 13 more children, including 2 sets of twins. But as we will see, only one of them, the most horrible of the whole bunch, was to survive beyond his teenage years. But what's more to the point, I mean, with all these babies coming out on a regular basis, some of them not lasting very long at all. This is why I say we don't know exactly how many. We do know of at least 14 children altogether, but there could have been 15 or 16. Sounds like Queen Victoria of England in the 19th century. She was producing them all over the place as well. So as more and more children came forth, Antoninus Pius pulled back more and more away from public life. He gave more and more duties to Marcus Aurelius. Well, as I said, nobody really expected Antoninus Pius to last very long, but he didn't actually die until 161. He had been emperor for 23 years, which made him the second longest reigning emperor after Augustus, with Tiberius after him, and he kept that title for the next 160 years or so. By that time, of course, Marcus Aurelius had already been basically serving as the new emperor in effect, and so there was absolutely no problem with him becoming emperor in his turn. This is Faustina Minor with this very different type of hairstyle. But when Antoninus Pius died, Marcus Aurelius had realized one thing that emperors before him hadn't really realized, and most emperors after him never really realized either. The Roman Empire was simply too big for one person to look after. Stretching from Britain down to Egypt, from the mouth of the Danube to the Atlantic, is just a massive amount of territory. So what he decided to do was to share the rule of the empire with his adoptive brother, who is, of course, Lucius Verus. Well, here we have Marcus Aurelius, who became emperor in 161 until 180. He shares his rule with Lucius Verus, who's here on the right-hand side, who's about 10 years younger. Can you tell the difference? Spot the differences. Quite simple, really. His moustache goes into his beard, his doesn't. He's always shown younger, he's always shown older. He's always shown a little bit more moody and sad and totally depressed. He's always shown as a person who enjoys life in many ways, sort of bright, outward-looking character. So they're fairly easy to distinguish. That gap between the moustache and the beard is the deciding factor. But Marcus Aurelius had often shown, anybody read Winnie the Pooh? You know, Eeyore the donkey. What's it been like today? Sunny. Yeah, sunny. Probably rain, probably rain. You know, I mean, Marcus Aurelius, you get that feeling about him. He's not a totally happy person. Well, one of the first things that he does, of course, is to commemorate his predecessor. And we have this coin of Marcus Aurelius showing a column that was dedicated to Antoninus Pius and Faustina, and the coin also shows Antoninus Pius. And again, you can see the point I made. You don't see this in the statues, this rather long face that he actually has. Well, this column was built in the Campus Martius. It was originally consisted of an 18-meter high, solid piece of pink Aswan Egyptian granite, which was 2 meters diameter. We know that this column shaft was actually made in the year 106, because that's what an inscription on the bottom of the column shaft says. So it must have been originally made for one of Trajan's pieces of work, but it was never used. And it obviously wasn't used for the Pantheon, so it was just sitting around. Now, how we know about this inscription is because, quite simply, until the 17th century, the column of Antoninus Pius and Faustina was still standing to its full height, but it had been covered with rubble and dirt and all sorts of muck, so you could only see the top 6 meters of it. And then somebody decided early in the 18th century to dig the whole thing out and pulled it out of the ground, intending to use it probably in the Vatican. But then there was a fire in that part of Rome, and all the column shaft fractured into pieces apart from the base. Fortunately, the actual base of the column was left in the ground, and when that was excavated in the 18th century, it was found to be a 2-meter high solid block of lunar marble with the most amazing series of decorations on it. Well, this is how it's displayed today inside the Vatican area. As you can imagine, the Pope's got most of the material there, the podium base of the column. Well, the front of the base is fairly straightforward. It is basically plain. Originally decorated with metal letters, and one of the popes had these replicated so we can have them put back in. You can still see the holes for the original letters behind these, and you can see it's decorated to the divine Antoninus Augustus. Antoninus Augustus is the official name of Marcus Aurelius, and Verus Augustus, his sons, dedicate this to the memory of Antoninus. That's the front of the column base. The other side is an apotheosis scene. The apotheosis scene, remember, is when you have this ceremony, the body of the emperor or the emperor's wife or relative of the emperor is burnt, is cremated, and an eagle is released to symbolize the fact that this person is becoming a god or about to become a god. So what we have here is an apotheosis scene of Antoninus Pius and Faustina together. Faustina, remember, died 140 or 141. Antoninus doesn't die until 161, but we ignore the chronology, or they do in this particular respect. So you've got this very classical type scene. Plain background. You've got Antoninus Pius and Faustina there. Antoninus Pius is holding a scepter with an eagle on the top. This is his symbol for being an emperor, the eagle of Jupiter. In the apotheosis ceremony, 2 eagles would be released. They're the birds of Jupiter. So you've got the 2 eagles on either side. They're being carried up by this personification. Not a god as such, it's a personification symbolizing something. In this case, it's aeon, eternity. They're deified, they will live forever. This was not there on the original. That was put on by one of the popes. In fact, if you ever see a classical statue with a fig leaf on it, you know that something has been knocked off and that has been put there. And in the British Museum, they've got this wonderful collection of parts that have been knocked off male statues in the Victorian period when they were replaced with these fig leaves, you know, so as not to shock ladies when they went into the museum. So ignore that bit there. Let's just look briefly up here. You see Faustina shown with that characteristic hairstyle of hers, hair pulled back, braided up like a bird's nest. A really lovely portrait of Antoninus Pius there, holding his scepter, and the face of Aeon, very Greek-like in this particular case. And see that she's shown here with that rather thick neck that we see on the coins as well. They're being sent up to heaven by the spirit, the personification of the Campus Martius. The Campus Martius is where the bodies were burned. Now this Greek-type figure is holding this obelisk with that little ball on the top. Well, we know of only one obelisk in the whole of Rome like that in the Roman period, and that was in the Campus Martius. So that's how we know that this represents the Campus Martius, where Antoninus Pius and Faustina were cremated. And then over here, of course, you've got Roma. I love the way Roma's going, bye, have a safe trip, gule gule, you know, sort of, you know, this smile there. Little shield down there with this little illustration of Romulus and Remus on it, so you know that it's definitely who it is. You've seen the front, you've seen the back. Let's look at the sides. They are almost identical. There are some very, very, very slight differences, but otherwise they are identical. And I put this series of 3 slides up because people never quite believe it. But the 2 sides are really almost identical. They really are a big surprise. The only differences between them are very, very slight details in the carving of the armour, of the faces, that sort of thing. What we have here, identical scenes of a military review. The type of ceremony that took place at an apotheosis celebration, a funeral celebration. And the reason why we have 2 matching sides is to emphasize the fact that now we have 2 rulers of Rome. It's, you've got Marcus Aurelius, who is the emperor, Pontifex Maximus, Lucius Verus, his assistant, sharing the responsibility of remembering their adoptive father, the inscription tells us that, and looking after the future administration of the Roman Empire. Well, as I said, what we've got here is a decursio. It's a sort of exercise type thing. A decursio in which you've got a group of horsemen who are galloping around this group of soldiers. It's connected to the apotheosis ceremony, the burial of both Faustina and of Antoninus Pius. You've got 17 horsemen going around here. All the horses are shown on little ledges like that. You get the horsemen usually appearing in 2s or 3s, something like that. The centre of each side, at the bottom, a single figure with a beard. So we can identify this person here as being Marcus Aurelius or Lucius Verus, whichever side you want to look at. The other horsemen represent members of the equestrian order, Rome's middle class. And we know that this type of thing would happen at the funeral ceremony. And we could also, you know, it's beautifully carved. We can see the details of the shoes. Notice they don't have stirrups. They don't put their feet into anything on either side of the saddle. The stirrup is a Turkic invention, which does not arrive in the West until the Byzantine period. But fortunately for the Romans, their horses were reasonably low, so you could sit down on them. And they had a very high saddle at the back and the front to keep them in place. Then in the centre, you've got this group of men who represent Praetorian guardsmen, the emperor's bodyguard. Now again, they're standing on this ledge like this, and we've got a part back view, a part side view, a part frontal view. When you look at the scene as a whole, though, I mean, it really is an illogical scene. What the sculptor has tried to do is to ignore the rules of perspective to a certain extent and represent something in which you've got a group of men standing in the circle of a group of horses. So all the horses are shown more or less the same size. We see them from the side. You get an idea of depth in that these must be at the front, closest to the viewer. They must be furthest away because they're at the top. But you've got that kind of circle, so it's almost as if you're sort of floating like that. You're getting a sort of 15, 20 degree angle view of them. Not quite bird's eye view, but nor is it a level view. But then in the centre, you're looking straight on the soldiers there. It really is a strange piece of work. But what also makes it very strange is look at the figures. You know, like that. They're cubic. They're squat. You know, they're kind of almost going back to the Vicar Magistri in many ways. But as we will see, this type of figure carving becomes increasingly common. And by the time we get to late antiquity, Constantine and so forth, this is a standard way of representing art. But a bigger contrast in Roman art, in one particular monument, you really cannot see. The apotheosis scene, purely classical, Greek type in every possible way you can think of, wide open background, Greek type face to Aeon, although it's a Roman subject. And then you have this on the other side. You can see the origins of this in the Vicar Magistri thing, but the figures are very cubic. The apotheosis scene, allegorical. Going back to that Greek idea. Here, Roman verism and historical relief. So it really is one of the most amazing sort of pieces of Roman art that you can ever go and see. And at that point, I will stop. I think just about, oh, 1 minute over. Will you forgive me? No.